Thank you very much for coming out, particularly on such a cold, blustery day. Before we start, though, just a show of hands, if anyone here feels there's reasonable doubt about who Shakespeare, the author, was. Anybody? 1, 2, 3. Okay, that's good. I'll take another show of hands at the end to see, sort of a program evaluation assessment tool, I guess. So in addition to my roles as a librarian in those collection areas, I think it's fair to say that any English professor in this country would probably also say that I am a crank, a conspiracy theorist, and a snob, because I don't believe that William Shakespeare, as I'll pronounce his name, of Stratford-upon-Avon, wrote the plays and poems of Shakespeare. The evidence has convinced me that the Earl of Oxford, Edward de Vere, was the nobleman who wrote under the name Shakespeare, for reasons of state and class. Before I continue, let me introduce you to my fellow wacky conspiracy theorists. On the left there is renowned Shakespearean actor Derek Jacobi, posing with a bust of Edward de Vere, actor Michael York, Charlie Chaplin, Sigmund Freud, Mark Rylance, the director of the first director of Shakespeare's Globe Theatre, and Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, all of whom advocated for Edward de Vere. Mark Twain, writing a decade before Oxford was identified as Shakespeare, wrote that the traditional Shakespeare of biography is like a brontosaur, 9 bones and 600 barrels of plaster of Paris. In his book, Is Shakespeare Dead? But over the past 15 years, there's been quite a lot of publishing in this field. There's a lot of scholarship, both anti-Stratfordian, that is doubting, criticizing, being skeptical of the traditional attribution, and not necessarily advocating for a particular candidate, and those that do advocate for Oxford. There's quite a lot of interest in this field these days. In particular, in 2013, there were 2 competing books that came out. Shakespeare Beyond Doubt, Evidence, Argument, Controversy, from the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, which advocated, of course, and argued for the traditional view and tried to debunk the skepticism. And then the Shakespeare Authorship Coalition came out with their Shakespeare Beyond Doubt, Exposing an Industry in Denial. In addition, there are theater companies around the world who are openly presenting their productions as Oxfordian productions. You can see here the E.T.A. Hoffman Theater in Hamburg, their production of Macbeth by Edward de Vere, the Oxford Shakespeare Company of New York City, As You Like It, William Shakespeare, the pen name of Edward de Vere. And then in 2011, the major motion picture Anonymous introduced mass audiences to the authorship debate. And it's a controversial movie, even within anti-Stratfordian and Oxfordian circles. But even the venerable Folger Shakespeare Library is hedging its bets. They recently introduced some interesting wording onto their website. The Folger in Washington, D.C. The Folger has been a major location for research into the authorship question and welcomes scholars looking for new evidence that sheds light on the play's origins. How this particular man, or anyone else, or anyone for that matter, could have produced such an astounding body of work is one of the great mysteries. If the current consensus on the authorship of the plays and poems is ever overturned, it will be because some new and extraordinary evidence is discovered. The Folger Shakespeare Library is the most likely place for such an unlikely discovery. So, however, as we shall see, all of these publications that I will be talking about are poorly represented in Canada's university libraries, and public libraries too, for that matter. I looked them up. The Winnipeg Public Library only has 1 book that I'll be talking about here, the Shakespeare Guide to Italy, and thank you to Lauren for putting up the display at the back. So this impressive scholarship is being overshadowed by these traditional biographies, vastly overshadowed by them. In fact, 17 university libraries in this country hold not a single book representing the anti-Stratfordian or Oxfordian view, so there's a lot of bias built in here. So I believe a stronger role on the academic library's part is needed to help inform students and faculty and interested members of the community that there is a debate, that it is a reasonable debate, and is one that we need to be better informed about. This is an issue, as Lauren mentioned, that I have published about in the past. I've got a book review coming out from the journal Brief Chronicles about a new book, Shakespeare and the Digital World. Decolonizing the Shakespeare Authorship Question, which looks at how the traditional view of Shakespeare contributed to the development of British nationalism and empire building. And then in the partnership, the Canadian Library Journal, looking at why this is an important issue for libraries, as a guest blogger, and in the pages of the Winnipeg Free Press book review column, I reviewed the book Contested Will. So before I get into, why we need to have more balanced library collections and a more vigorous debate, we need to understand what the debate is about. So what do we know about William Shakespeare, the poet and playwright? Born in 1564, the son of a glove maker in a poor provincial town, he is sent to school where he studies classical literature. He marries at 18, apprentices probably as a legal clerk, before making his way to London in his early 20s, where he gains notice as an actor and a playwright, is publicly chastised and mocked as an upstart crow and a notorious pamphlet by Robert Greene. After securing the patronage of Henry Wriothesley, the 3rd Earl of Southampton, he dedicates 2 poems to him in 1593 and 1594. By 1597, he's earned enough money from the sale of his plays and from his shares in London's theatres that he's able to buy New Place in Stratford-upon-Avon, one of the most expensive properties there. In 1603, he publishes his most famous tragedy, Hamlet, which is based on an earlier play, which is now lost to us, and is known as the Hamlet, probably by Thomas Kidd. And he continues to buy property, trade in malt, sue people, and write plays, before he retires in about 1612 or so, where he lives in Stratford-upon-Avon and dies in 1616. Does that sound about right? That's the Shakespeare we learned about in school. What if I were to tell you that virtually none of what I said just now is backed up by historical documentation? Apart from the records of purchasing properties, the fact that those poems were published when I said they were, all of this is supposition. It's all guesswork, built upon guesswork over centuries, and then repeated and repeated uncritically by biographers and taught by teachers as fact. Certainly the Shakespeare I learned when I was in theater school. We have no idea what Shakespeare looked like. If you do a search, this is my Google Images search for portraits of Shakespeare, there's many different ones that are claiming to be portraits of Shakespeare. They're all different. We have no idea what he looked like. The busts all look different. This is the only one with any claim to authenticity is the one in Stratford-upon-Avon at the church there, which Mark Twain famously described as having the deep, 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 deep expression of a bladder. He's just staring off into space. So there's no record of his education, no record tying him to any literary activities, no evidence that he was ever paid for writing plays, no justification to believe that the Hamlet referred to in 1589 by Thomas Nash isn't the same Hamlet that we read now. There's no evidence that Thomas Kidd ever wrote another play called Hamlet. It's all been made up. It's made up out of whole cloth. Well, why have biographers made up such facts? Because the traditional attribution of the transcendent plays and poems of Shakespeare makes absolutely no sense without them. Marrying the actual documented trail of William Shakespeare, and that's how his name was spelled in the documents, that we have Shake-Speare, it makes no sense without this. And this is a painting, the infant Shakespeare attended by nature and the passions. This is sort of a secular, religious view of Shakespeare as having been gifted by nature/God. It's the only way to explain what he knows and what he was able to write about, because there's no way that he could have learned it in his provincial town, born to probably illiterate parents. And this is the sort of the myth, the Stratford narrative. But these are the documents. This is the documented trail of William Shakespeare. Bills of complaint, bond of surety, record of payment to the chamberlain's men, writ for surety of the peace. That's kind of like a restraining order against Shakespeare. So, someone was afraid of him. There's a list of tax defaulters, more tax defaulters. He defaulted on his taxes a lot. But what these records do not show is any trace of a literary life. There's no commendatory verses to him. There's no record of payment for his plays. In Philip Henslow's diary and the stationer's registry, there's no record of payments to him for writing plays. So how do we get then from this to this? How do we get library shelves full of biographies, hundreds of pages long, that constitute this Shakespeare that is renowned around the world and accepted as the author? Well, from Jonathan Bates, Soul of the Age, it is not outrageous to imagine, guesswork of course, but I have a hunch that, I have an instinctive sense that we cannot rule out the possibility that, could it be then that one of the two could easily have been, he may well have been there, the players may well have known, etc., etc. From Stephen Greenblatt's Will in the World. In the summer of 1585, William Stratford may have been working in the glover's shop, perhaps, or making a bit of money as a teacher or a lawyer's assistant. In his spare time, he must have continued to write poetry, practice the lute, hone his skills as a fencer, that is, work on his ability to impersonate the lifestyle of a gentleman. His northern sojourn, assuming he had one, was behind him. If in Lancashire, etc., etc., etc. These books are largely written in the conditional tense, filled with ifs, musts, haves. It's reasonable to assume that. The challenge for the Shakespeare biographer is to marry these uncontested facts of lawsuits and purchases of property with the transcendence and the brilliance of the plays and poems. Historian William Rubinstein, remarking on this tendency, observes that all orthodox biographies of Shakespeare take liberties with or actually invent facts about the supposed playwright, such as no historian would allow for a moment for an academically credible biography of an important man or woman of the past. As a result, the Shakespeare canon essentially appears by magic. No juvenilia, no literary paper trail or relevant life experience, and placed so late in the Elizabethan era and the early Jacobean era that it makes Shakespeare appear to be derivative of earlier works and contemporaries, such as Christopher Marlowe, John Lilly, and Anthony Munday. So Shakespeare kind of looks like a copycat, or an outright plagiarist, but yet one imbued with the grace of nature/God. Henry James said, "I am sort of haunted by the conviction that the divine William is the biggest and most successful fraud ever practiced on a patient world." Because the divine intervention required to explain Shakespeare has to explain this enormous gulf between the records and the literature. As the Shakespeare Authorship Coalition puts it, the works show extensive knowledge of law, philosophy, classical literature, ancient and modern history, mathematics, astronomy, art, medicine, horticulture, heraldry, military and naval terminology and tactics, etiquette and manners of the nobility, English, French, and Italian court life, Italy, and aristocratic pastimes such as falconry, equestrian sports, and tennis. Nothing that we know about Mr. Shakespeare can account for this. Dr. W.H. Furness, the editor of the Variorum Shakespeare in 1866, put it this way: "I am one of the many," and mind you, this is somebody who edited the works of Shakespeare and believes in the man from Stratford. "I am one of the many who have never been able to bring the life of William Shakespeare and the plays of Shakespeare to within planetary distance of one another." Are there any two things in the world more incongruous? Dating Shakespeare is also rife with difficulties. Even if you compare standard works of chronology that accept William of Stratford as the author, they don't agree on when the plays were written or published. The printing dates are one thing, but when were the plays actually written? There's analysis of the references made within the plays and the plays rather, to say perhaps they're contemporary allusions, but they are all speculative and conflicting. The organizing principle, though, is that they are organized around the presumed dates of the author, 1564 to 1616. All 36 plays and a whole bunch of apocrypha have to be crammed into those years. Even earlier, if you accept that he retired in 1612. The problem, though, is that we've got all kinds of too early evidence. We've got a reference to a Hamlet in 1589, a reference to a Taming of the Shrew in the late 1570s, to a Romeo and Juliet in the early 1560s, before William of Stratford was even born. How do we explain this? Well, it means that he found these works by other people and adapted them. So it positions Shakespeare as a borrower, and it also appears to exclude the candidacy of Edward de Vere, who died in 1604. Most notably, The Tempest, which most orthodox scholars believe was influenced by a description of a shipwreck in 1609, but as I'll discuss a little later, that has been pretty thoroughly debunked. So one of the major problems for the traditional view is the publication of Shakespeare's sonnets. Note the hyphen. A lot of anti-Stratfordians will point out that names in Elizabethan literature with hyphens in them indicated a made-up name, that we're intended to read this as a pseudonym, and that it's also not the sonnets by William Shakespeare, it's Shakespeare's sonnets, as if that's it, there's no more, these are them. But more interestingly, the dedication says to a third party, saying, "We wish you that eternity promised by our ever-living poet." This is 1609. William of Stratford dies 7 years later in 1616. Scholars have looked through contemporary Elizabethan literature, Jacobean literature. Nobody uses the phrase ever-living to refer to someone who is in fact alive. It's a sign of the immortality of your work after death. So, what do we know about Shakespeare then from the record? Very little. But what can we glean about him from what we read, particularly in the sonnets, is starkly different from what the traditional biographer will tell us about Shakespeare. We read in the sonnets, Sonnet 91, "Thy love is better than high birth to me. Wherefore say not that I am old?" And traditional scholars will say, why is Shakespeare calling himself old? He's only in his 30s when these things came out. But it makes a lot more sense if it's written by an older man. "When in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state, speak of my lameness, and I straight will halt, when I, once gone, to all the world must die." Reading the sonnets, we become intimately aware that the author is high-born, but in disgrace, worn with age, suffering from lameness, some kind of injury, and certain that he will be alienated from his works, that they will be published without his name on them, and he will be unknown to posterity, even though the works themselves will be immortal. That 126 of these sonnets are addressed in the most arduous and amorous fashion to another man, the fair youth of the sonnets, that most scholars on all sides of the debate agree must have been Henry Wriothesley, the 3rd Earl of Southampton, to whom he dedicated Venus and Adonis and the Rape of Lucrece. He writes, "O thou, my lovely boy, a woman's face with nature's own hand painted hast thou, the master-mistress of my passion." To imagine that William of Stratford from this poor provincial town could presume to address to a member of the aristocracy such passionate, intimate poetry at a time when sodomy could be punished by death respect. Shakespeare also tells us in Sonnet 76 that he is writing under a pseudonym. Why write I all one, ever the same, and keep invention in a noted weed? We see the word weed used throughout the plays as a costume. When a character shows up in disguise, they're wearing a weed. And it's a noted weed. People know that it's a disguise. So why am I bothering to write under a pseudonym when every word almost tells my name, showing their birth and when they did proceed? So apparently it was all but an open secret to those in the know, in Elizabeth's court, that Shakespeare was a made-up name concealing someone powerful who could not be named. In 1640, there's a dedication. Shakespeare, we must be silent in thy praise. In 1623, Thomas Vickers writes an account of the great writers of the Elizabethan and Jacobean eras and adds at the end, and to this we should add that famous poet who takes his name from shaking and spear. So this is a contemporary acknowledgement that it was a pseudonym, that famous poet who takes his name. So this is why so many skeptics, including Walt Whitman, have looked to the wolfish earls that surrounded Queen Elizabeth in her court, who wrote poetry anonymously and pseudonymously and privately. So, which brings us to the work of J. Thomas Looney, English school teacher, who discovered Edward de Vere as Shakespeare in his 1920 book, Shakespeare Identified. The anti-Stratfordians of the 19th century looked to authors like Francis Bacon and Christopher Marlowe and many, many others. Apparently there's some 70 alternate candidates, which the orthodox scholars used to ridicule doubt about Shakespeare. Oh, you know, if they thought Queen Elizabeth was Shakespeare, it's ridiculous. Well, what they all had in common was that they looked to somebody who was already known for their brilliant writing and said, well, this could be Shakespeare, and then they looked for evidence internal to the canon to try to match it. Well, Looney didn't do that. Stratfordians have also had a field day with J. Thomas Looney's funny name. Oh, that Looney theory about Oxford. Oh, he had a funny name. We don't need to take it seriously then. Well, what he did is that Looney had no idea who Shakespeare might have been, but he had been teaching Shakespeare for years. He knew the attribution made no sense, so he began to look for characteristics. What does the poet tell us about himself? What can we read in the plays? What must he have known? Well, he believed he was a mature, eccentric man of recognized genius, a lyric poet of recognized talent, who probably would have published under his own name. This person would have had pronounced and known literary tastes in aristocratic circles, would have been known as an enthusiast in the world of drama, had superior education, of probable Catholic leanings, and you have to keep in mind what that would imply after the reign of Henry VIII. Feudal connections of the higher aristocracy, close to royalty with Lancastrian sympathies. The history plays look at the Lancastrian side of the War of the Roses with great sympathy, and that they're the good guys in those plays. An enthusiast for Italy. 10 of the plays are set there with remarkable details. A follower of sport, including falconry. The sports of the aristocracy are used metaphorically throughout the works. A lover of music. Improvident in money matters. Othello says, who steals my purse steals trash. So this sentiment of the poet is quite at odds with the penny-pinching malt merchant who sued people for small sums. And doubtful and somewhat conflicting in his attitude towards women, which in 1920 is a genteel way of saying bisexual or gay. So, with this list in hand, Looney finds a collection of 16th century poetry, and he very quickly identifies a poem that is written very much in the style of Venus and Adonis, which was the very first work published under the name William Shakespeare. It's a poem called Women's Changeableness by Edward de Vere, and it goes like this. Listen to this. Imagine you are J. Thomas Looney. It's World War I is raging out in the world outside, and you've made this list, and you find this poem. If women could be fair and yet not fond, or that their love were firm, not fickle still, I would not marvel that they made men bond by service long to purchase their goodwill. But when I see how frail those creatures are, I laugh that men forget themselves so far. To mark the choice they make and how they change, how oft from Phoebus do they fly to Pan, unsettled still like haggards wild they range, those gentle birds that fly from man to man. Who would not scorn and shake them from the fist, and let them fly, fair fools, which way they list? Now, Looney recognizes, many of you who are familiar with the writing of Shakespeare, how extraordinarily Shakespearean this poem is. Note the easy use of legal terminology, purchase and bond, the metaphoric use of aristocratic sports, hawking, the comparison of women to haggards, which are untrained hawks. Othello does that. He wants to prove Desdemona haggard, that women are frail. Frailty, thy name is woman. So, Looney thought he had a pretty good candidate. And then he goes to the library, and he pulls out the Dictionary of National Biography, and he finds the entry for Edward de Vere, which I happen to have here from the University of Winnipeg Library. And he reads this. Let's keep our eye on these characteristics, shall we? Vere, Edward D., 17th Earl of Oxford, born 2nd of April, 1550. The only son of John de Vere, 16th Earl of Oxford, by his second wife Margaret, daughter of John Golding, and sister of Arthur Golding, translator of Ovid, Ovid's Metamorphoses being one of the most significant sources for Shakespeare. Golding joined young Edward in the capacity of tutor. Edward was thoroughly grounded in French and Latin, but at the same time learned to dance, ride, and shoot. While manifesting a natural taste for music and literature, the youth developed into a waywardness of temper, which led him into every form of extravagance and into violent quarrels with other members of his guardian's household. Oxford became a prominent figure at Elizabeth's court during his boyhood. In 1575, Oxford realized his ambition of foreign travel, and with the permission of the authorities, made his way to Italy. To him is assigned the credit of first introducing from Italy into England embroidered gloves, sweet bags, perfumed leather jerkins, and costly washes or perfumes. He was held up to ridicule and satirized as an Italianate Englishman with affected apparel and gestures. Following his return from, a temporary alienation from his wife followed his return from his Italian tour. Although the difference was arranged, his domestic relations were not thenceforth very cordial. Oxford's eccentricities and irregularities of temper grew. Oxford had squandered the better part of his fortune upon men of letters whose bohemian mode of life attracted him. Oxford, despite his violent and perverse temper, his eccentric taste in dress, and his reckless waste of his substance, evinced a genuine interest in music and wrote verse of much lyric beauty. Putnam and Mears reckon him among the best for comedy in his day, but although he was a patron of a company of players, no specimen of his dramatic productions survive. So, you can imagine the thrill that Looney must have experienced. This is one of the great moments in reference library history. I wish I'd been there. From this one entry alone, almost every criteria on his list is satisfied. So he writes his book. It's published after World War I. He puts it in a safe because he doesn't want the book to be overshadowed by the war. It's released in 1920. So almost a century now has gone by. And all of the scholarship since then has only reinforced his theory, corrected some of the things that people feel he got wrong. But the gist of it is that we have, in Oxford's extant poems, the missing Shakespeare juvenilia. These poems that we have of Oxford's were written in his teens. There's numerous biographical details in the plays that are matched with Oxford's life that conventional biographers could only dream to have for their candidate. When Oxford comes back from Italy, his boat is hijacked by pirates and he's left on the shore without his shirt. The same thing happens to Hamlet. Hamlet's father-in-law, Polonius, most scholars recognize is modeled on William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, who is Edward de Vere's father-in-law. There's many more, and I don't have time to get into them. But being 14 years older than William of Stratford, his lifespan fits much better with what we see of records, references to Shakespearean works in the 1570s and the 1580s that William of Stratford could not possibly have written. It requires no imaginary Hamlet by Thomas Kyd to explain that Edward de Vere wrote Hamlet in the 1580s. And it is other playwrights, such as John Lilly and Anthony Munday, whom, not incidentally, were Oxford's secretaries, who then may be seen as borrowing from him and not the other way around. In Edward de Vere, we have every characteristic. We have the Shakespeare that we read in the plays and poems. But the orthodox scholars will still argue no, that the Shakespeare that we've known for the past 400 years and 200 years of biography was blessed with the power of imagination, quote unquote, and was able to either imagine all of the details in the canon, remember them from his grammar school days in Stratford, or else he learned of them secondhand by hanging out in the Mermaid Tavern and chatting up lawyers, sailors, soldiers, historians, Italians, Greeks, doctors, Frenchmen, astronomers, aristocratic sportsmen, scientists, members of the nobility, musicians, horticulturalists, etc., etc., etc. The problem with the whole imagination thing is that if that's true, then why did William of Stratford, as Shakespeare, imagine so thoroughly and consistently the life of Edward de Vere? Okay, so what I did for my research then is I wanted to see what the status was of this scholarship into the authorship question in academic libraries in Canada as compared to traditional biographies. So I took 12 traditional recent publications since 2000, including the 9 Lives of William Shakespeare, which includes 9 possible scenarios for the biography, and then writes 9 short stories, basically Shakespeare fan fiction, about who Shakespeare could have been, or rather the life he would have had. So these are all traditional biographies with the may have, ifs, thens. Shakespeare Unbound, The Quest for Shakespeare, Shadow Play, these are all at the back display there. Thank you, Lauren, for pulling those. And some of these do take the Looney kind of perspective of, yeah, there's evidence that he was lame, that he was Catholic in his leanings, that he's making political commentary about Elizabeth's court. But of course, they're still sticking with the traditional attribution. David Ellis, in The Truth About William Shakespeare, says, you got to stop making up stuff about Shakespeare. Yes, he was the guy from Stratford, but these biographies are basically fiction. Knock it off. We can't know anything more about him. We've been looking for 400 years. There's nothing more to learn. Just focus on the plays and poems. Contested Will looks at the debate and concludes at the end that Shakespeare was Shakespeare. And then there's Shakespeare Beyond Doubt, a collection of essays, which interestingly looks not at a single recent publication, in fact, nothing from the last 60 years, produced by anti-Stratfordians. So a lot of very stale commentary about people who wrote in the 19th century, which is kind of interesting. Imagine a PhD candidate not including references to the literature of the last 60 years, and certainly none of these. Shakespeare's Lost Kingdom by Charles Beauclerk. I actually toured Charles Beauclerk around Edmonton 20 years ago, and he did some fantastic lectures in the public schools there. His book looks at the Earl of Southampton as perhaps Oxford and Elizabeth's illegitimate son, which is a very controversial theory among Oxfordians. The Shakespeare Guide to Italy, Richard Paul Rowe, 2011. Rowe spent years walking through Italy, looking at all of the settings of the Shakespeare plays and concluding that whoever Shakespeare was, he had to have gone to Italy. But of course, the conventional Shakespeare biography never left England. Shakespeare's Unorthodox Biography, which makes no claim about who Shakespeare was, only who he wasn't. Shakespeare by Another Name, which is a literary biography of de Vere as Shakespeare. The Earl of Oxford and the Making of Shakespeare looks at the 1570s and 80s as building up to that body of literature we know as Shakespeare's and seeding the English Renaissance. Shakespeare Suppressed, again, looking at the evidence and why the Academy won't look at it honestly. Another collection of essays, Great Oxford. Dating Shakespeare's Plays by Kevin Gilbury is like the first unbiased attempt to look at the evidence, including this stuff from the 70s and 80s, that William of Stratford would have been too young to have written. And again, not making a claim for Oxford, but looking at the Oxfordian evidence for dating as well as these others. Shakespeare and his authors, it's a collection of essays. On the date, sources of The Tempest, saying that the 1609 record of a shipwreck was probably plagiarized from something from the 1580s, and in any case wasn't even published until years after William of Stratford died, so it couldn't have been a source for The Tempest. Ergo, Edward de Vere could have written The Tempest. There's no reason to date it later than 1604. The Monument, looking at the sonnets in terms of the theory that Southampton was Oxford's son, and then Shakespeare Beyond Doubt, the collection of essays responding to the other Shakespeare Beyond Doubt. So I took a look at these across the country, university libraries only. I excluded technical colleges, religious institutions, public libraries, and found that these conventional biographies, 299 copies across 58 universities. So we've got an average, each book is held by an average of 29.3 libraries. Many, multiple copies. Will in the World, 51 libraries across the country. Shakespeare, the biography by Ackroyd, 34. Shakespeare Unbound, only held by 6. So there are some without a lot of coverage. Now, the anti-Stratfordian, skeptical, Oxfordian books, 100 books across the country, for an average of only 8.3 libraries holding copies of these. The dating Shakespeare's plays, not a single library. The Monument, not a single library. Shakespeare Suppressed, challenging the Academy, only one library. In fact, I believe that's the University of Winnipeg's because I bought it. Shakespeare Beyond Doubt, exposing an industry in denial, 2 copies, one of which I bought for the University of Winnipeg. So, yeah, there's a great disparity of collections here. One possible explanation is that only major publishers, mostly major publishers rather, are publishing the orthodox traditional literature. Major publishers, 6, academic publishers, 3, independent 2, and 1 religious publishing house. As opposed to only 3 major publishers for the anti-Stratfordian, 2 academic, but also alternative, independent, small, and a couple are self-published. So it's more difficult for this literature to find its way into the review journals. The only book the Winnipeg Public Library has is the Shakespeare Guide to Italy. So none of this literature is represented here. Now, so to wrap up this part of the analysis, there's 3 times as much Stratfordian literature, or copies of it, in our academic libraries than titles representing alternative perspectives. A Stratfordian title is 3 times as likely to be in a Canadian university library, and Canadian university libraries are twice as likely to hold a Stratfordian title than an anti-Stratfordian one. So students and faculty are not being given the opportunity to make up their own minds about this debate. They can't easily find this literature and read it. So for the next stage of my research, what I wanted to do is consider how these books are discovered. In the library biz, we call it indexing, classifying books on the shelf. Here at the public library, it's the Dewey Decimal System. In the academic library, it's the Library of Congress system. And then within the book, there are subject headings that you find in the catalog that describe what the book is about. Now, there's a lot of bias, a lot of criticism in the literature about how the Library of Congress in the United States classifies books in space and describes them in terms of subject headings. Some of the issues are ghettoization, isolating a topic away from the mainstream of that issue, treating it as an exception to the norm, that it's not mainstream. Omission, so completely excluding the ideas, the theories that are being described by using a completely inappropriate term. Or inappropriate structure, that the norm, and there's a lot of criticism about the Library of Congress for being very Americano, Eurocentric, very Christian-centric, and so excluding a lot of alternative viewpoints, but that inappropriate structure can exclude and misrepresent controversial topics. And then using biased and pejorative terminology. So let's see what happens with the Library of Congress classification scheme for the authorship question. So, Shakespeare William dash authorship. Not identity, but authorship. So, the Bacon-Shakespeare controversy. Back in the 19th century, this was primarily a Francis Bacon versus Shakespeare thing. But that was, 100 years ago. It hasn't been a Baconian issue for a very long time. Pro-Shakespeare. So there's pro-Shakespeare literature, meaning folks like myself are anti-Shakespeare. Then there's the Baconian theory. Oh, and then there's controversial literature. There's early literature to 1880, meaning that anything after 1880 is recent. And then there's English and other hypotheses. So the Library of Congress classification scheme dates from 1897, and it appears not to have been updated since. So treating the authorship question as primarily a Baconian issue is really out of date. The 1881 and on being recent, very out of date. What's interesting about the controversial literature is that according to the guidelines in the Library of Congress, controversial literature as a heading is a form subdivision, it says, for under religion, for works that argue against or express opposition to those religious groups or works. So the Library of Congress is essentially calling these works about Shakespeare heretical, in the strictest religious sense. Even though the most recent edition of the Library of Congress classification scheme that says that you're not supposed to use the term controversial literature for anything but religion. Radical librarian Sanford Berman, who worked at Hennepin County down in Minneapolis, wrote some very influential works critiquing the Library of Congress, wrote at this subheading. He says, the result of this practice is twofold: to segregate and ghettoize criticism of religious entities and holy books, and to make it appear by extension that pro-religious material is not controversial, but rather normal, mainstream, non-contentious, and acceptable. So, by extension, then, any doubt, skepticism about who Shakespeare was is not normal, not mainstream, and unacceptable. And the fact that Edward de Vere, who's been the leading candidate for almost 100 years now, does not have his own number, but Francis Bacon does, is an amazing omission. So we see that these criticisms that identified here, that the structure is inappropriate, it's ghettoized, it's segregated, the terminology is inappropriate. In terms of the subject headings, Shakespeare William, 1564 to 1616, authorship, i.e., there's no doubt about who Shakespeare was, it's that guy with those birth dates. Edward de Vere dates authorship. Now, Shakespeare William dates and sonnets, that subject heading was attached to that book I just showed you, The Monument, which is entirely about Edward de Vere as Shakespeare and his presumed son, the Earl of Southampton. It is not in any sense about this guy from Stratford with those birth dates. That subject heading completely misrepresents what that book is about. So between anemic collections and outdated biased terminology and structures, academic libraries are at present doing a fairly poor job of representing and providing access to this literature. At the University of Winnipeg, I've tried to get around this. This is a subject guide that I created with a colleague of mine, where we treat Shakespeare studies in a very interdisciplinary way, with literary studies, performance studies, film, cultural, and then authorship studies gets its own tab. And providing access to the subject headings and other sources. So I'm not suggesting that there should be or can be at this point a one-to-one ratio of this literature. There's simply been hundreds of years to produce this other literature. However, greater balance is needed. That 17 of these titles are, 17 universities in this country don't have access to any of these books means that students are being deprived of the opportunity to get to know about this debate. Psychiatrist Richard Wagaman, who's published over 50 articles about Shakespeare, wrote that orthodox Shakespeare scholarship is the history of shackled thought, of brainwashed intellect, of curtailed curiosity. And I think one of the most significant examples of this is that because we know that William of Stratford did not leave England and could not have gone to Italy, that therefore everything in the Italian place must have been made up, ergo, we don't have to actually bother to go there to find out for ourselves. Until Richard Roe spends years walking on the ground through Italy and finding the sycamore trees that are described in Romeo and Juliet, the bridge that's described in Taming of the Shrew, the courtyard that's described in The Merchant of Venice, and on and on. The author had to have gone there. This book was published in 2011, but he was the first one to actually take the initiative and to actually take what's written on the page at face value and believe what the author has written. The traditional attribution of the greatest works in the English language to a small-minded businessman has proven astonishingly difficult to dislodge, despite the almost complete lack of documentary evidence for it. But positing Shakespeare of Stratford, the businessman, malt merchant, etc., as the author sheds absolutely no illumination on the plays and poems. They may as well be anonymous, for all that that tradition gives us in terms of insights. Or pick another provincial businessman and say that he wrote them. What difference would it make? The Stratford myth, as some believe was the deliberate intention at the time, strips the plays and poems of their political content, of what they were saying about Elizabeth's court at the time, therefore disguising the true history of the Elizabethan era and the origins of the English Renaissance. The Stratford myth, with its Horatio Alger-like rise of the commoner to the pinnacle of Elizabethan society, may appeal to our modern, democratic, egalitarian sensibilities, but it has no basis in the realities of Elizabethan England, which was, for all practical purposes, like North Korea. It was a very dangerous authoritarian society. This myth has also prevented generations of school children from truly understanding and appreciating and enjoying Shakespeare. Shakespeare remains unknown and unknowable, remote and godlike, that painting of nature attending baby, the infant Shakespeare, instead of a real person with whom young readers can empathize. How differently, how much more enthusiastically would students approach Shakespeare if they knew him as Edward de Vere, a fiery, temperamental young man, ambitious, gifted, extremely creative in writing and music, athletic, handsome, flamboyant, coming to terms with his bisexuality in a society where that could be punished by death, often angry, coping with the loss of his father at age 12, thrown into an environment not of his choosing, at one point accused of murder, thwarted in his ambitions by powerful men, wanting to see the world, and navigating a treacherously dangerous world of royalty and succession in which he would come to play an integral role as a theatrical propagandist. That is the Shakespeare I want my daughter and her friends to read about and study in school, rather than this penny-pinching merchant who must have probably talked to some Italian lawyer in a pub. Shakespeare studies, as it is presently anchored on this hapless, unsupportable myth of the traditional attribution, is in a state of crisis. It's dominated by this circular reasoning. Of course Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare. It's circular reasoning. Of course Mark Twain wrote Mark Twain, but that doesn't mean we look for historical records of someone born with that name. Thomas Kuhn, in his classic book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, says that paradigm shifts in a discipline only happen when that discipline reaches a state of crisis. And I believe that Shakespeare studies is on the verge of that crisis, one on the same magnitude as the geological sciences were, with Alfred Wegener's theory of continental drift, introduced in 1915, but ridiculed for decades by the established academy for being ridiculous, to think that continents could float around. So part of the shift to a new paradigm must involve the young. students with open minds and a willingness to engage in new, challenging, and unpopular ideas. I want to print this shirt and give it to my daughter and her classmates when they start studying Shakespeare in high school. For young people to be able to do this, however, the academic libraries need to provide a fertile ground through collections so that these ideas can be discovered and universities be open to the pedagogical approaches necessary for those ideas to be analyzed, weighed, and discussed. Given enough time, who knows? Because, as Shakespeare wrote, time's glory is to calm contending kings, to unmask falsehoods and bring truth to light. Thank you very much.